Hey everybody, my name is Pete VanVolkingburgh, and I'm excited to be here with you. We're going to do a quick pass over of a lot of big things, so we will not get to everything in this 30 minutes or so, but I'm hoping that this will give a good foundation for learning, for asking questions, and for seeking out more information where it makes sense. I'm going to transition now to a little bit of a statistics dump, where we're going to unload some statistics. They're not always incredibly pleasant. They're difficult statistics, but I think it gives us a picture of how important mental health is today in Canada for the youth. It's important to hear these statistics because it's important to know where we are legitimately starting from before we can really move the direction we want to go. If I weigh 500 pounds, but I can convince myself that I'm actually only 250 pounds, I'm never going to see the need for change. It's not until I step on a scale and see the numbers that I'm able to go, this is actually where I'm starting from. Statistics and taking a hard look at some of these numbers, I hope will be something that motivates all of us to acknowledge our starting point, and to be able to at least have the conversation from there to move in a specific direction. First statistic I have here is that 86% of students report daily social media use, with 16 to 20% reporting more than 5 hours of daily social media use. That 16 to 20% is what we consider clinically problematic. That these are numbers that are massively concerning, and these are students that are spending time scrolling through social media to find approval, to find acceptance, and to find value. This is a battle that our any previous generation just simply did not have to deal with, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The next statistic is that an estimated 10 to 20% of Canadian youth are affected by a mental illness or disorder. This is the highest among youth in the industrialized world. That means 10 to 20% of our students have wrestled with addiction, depression, anxiety, or some other form of clinically relevant mental illness or disorder. The highest in the industrialized world. The next statistic is that wait lists for treatment for youth and mental health crisis are often as long as 1 year. That means for every institution that is willing to step in and take on the care and the rehabilitation of students that are in youth that are in a mental health crisis, whether that is an addiction crisis or whether that is some other form of life controlling crisis, they will be put on a wait list of up to 1 year. And this is the norm. That we simply at the moment do not have the resources to handle these crises as quickly as they're lining up to be treated. This is something that as the church and as youth workers we want to look at and think how we can effectively engage these students in need, to see if we are able to partner with agencies or partner with families or partner with students to be able to offer some hope in crisis while the institutions that offer the medical help may put them on a long wait list. The next reality is that Canadian youth have the third highest suicide rate in the industrialized world. The Indigenous community is even higher than that, but as a whole, Canadian youth have the third highest suicide rate in the industrialized world. These are suicides that are really happening. And however you feel you will land with the topic of psychology and with the topics of mental health, this is something we can't ignore. That Canada has the third highest rate of youth suicide in the industrialized world. And we need to figure something out because this is a terrifying statistic that is continuing to rack our country, our communities, and the families around us with an unbelievable amount of grief. In Canada, on that same note, suicide accounts for 24% of all deaths among 15 to 24-year-olds. 24% of all death in that age range comes from a voluntary taking of someone's own life. That suicide is a topic regardless of where you land, again, on this mental health conversation or on the topic of psychology, this is a reality that we are dealing with, that the hopelessness and the despair that predate the actual suicide, that come before the actual event, this is something that's driving our youth to kill themselves at an incredibly disturbing rate. And then in the same vein, in Canada, suicide is the second leading cause of death among 10 to 24-year-olds. That, again, suicide is something that we need to look at very closely and figure out what we can do, because it is killing our students at an incredibly high rate. Working with youth actually brings about some unique challenges in the mental health and physiological development department. Anyone who's worked any amount of time with youth understands that there are moments of unpredictability, that even students that are the most even-keeled have moments of instability emotionally, and that hitting puberty and engaging the changes that they're experiencing and the social realities that are changing so quickly for them, between junior high and high school, really make it a complicated age for us to engage effectively. And we need to be on top of our game, understanding what's happening to them, understand what's happening around them, and do our best to step into that world to help them navigate their own circumstances in a way that's going to have an impact. For us, we see an incredible amount of growth in these years, where capacity changes, where kids go from children to seeming to be able to reason through things like adults. But this development actually takes a lot longer than we think it does. We have things like the legal drinking age set at 19 years old, when most people are not fully developed until their mid-20s. The main component of development that can actually cause problems for teenagers in particular has to do with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the last lobe to develop in an adult, and the prefrontal cortex is actually a brain structure that controls impulsivity and evaluates consequences and risk to decisions. This might explain a little bit to why teenagers, especially teenage boys, are so unaware of the risk involved with certain activities or actions or friend choices. It is also probably the number one reason that I use to discuss with high school students why to abstain from alcohol or drugs or sexual relationships. Because for a high school student who is 15 or 16 years old, that part of their brain that actually helps them evaluate good decisions isn't where it needs to be to safely evaluate risk. Which is why so many students go through a wild period from 15 to 19 years old. And then if you run into them 5, 6, 7 years later, they can come across as a totally different kid. I can think of a few boys that I went to youth group with specifically, who were wild men through high school and who've mellowed out into super responsible husbands and fathers and contributing members to society. We need to recognize that in students, that prefrontal cortex is not there. That impulse control is not there. We've been asked a question before if we can speed that up at all, if there's anything we can do to speed it up. To speed up the development, not particularly. There are things that will slow down the development and may actually impact the development at all. There are a number of good studies indicating that cannabis in the developing brain for younger students, pre-20, that instances of high cannabis use, smoking a lot of weed, can slow the development and actually stunt the development of the prefrontal cortex, which can lead to impulsivity and poor decision making into adulthood, and potentially their entire lives if that brain structure doesn't develop fully. It's also something that we want to speak biblically about. The Bible emphasizes discernment and wisdom. That is not necessarily a trait that is always very prevalent among youth. That's where we need to come in, and we would like to have real conversations with them about drugs, about alcohol, about sexual relationships, about decision making, and do our best to encourage caution, to encourage wisdom. Of course, the better decisions a student makes, the better they're set up in the future, even as they're still developing. That for boys and for girls, if they have a mentor, if they have a supportive environment where they can come and really wrestle through these conversations and really come up to a place where they believe they have an answer that is well thought out and practical, we can see better decisions being made by students with the appropriate guidance. Too many students will rely on the ethic of, if it feels good, do it, because that's something that is pushed by the world. It's something that they can find easily on social media, and it's something that is probably echoed in their friends group, that it's a lot of fun to engage in these behaviors that will ultimately be part of the way that destroys them. We need to push back against that with good answers, that it's not sinful to have these conversations, that it's not a problem for us to have these conversations, but that we've thought our way through it in a way that's going to maybe give them a bit of a better answer. Students will find an answer. Students will go somewhere to look for advice, to look for direction. And too often, the adults in lives of students maybe aren't paying attention or aren't equipped, or don't have the relationship with the student to give a good answer, or to even be the ones that are asked the question. We need to do everything in our power to build a relationship with the students so that when these questions come up, they're going to feel like they can come to us and that we're going to give them a solid answer with real wisdom behind it. And hopefully we can be contributing to the healthy development of the students that we're close to. The impact of social media is something that I don't want to miss here. This is something that even my generation, which is only, I graduated from high school 14 years ago, something like that. But since then, the reality has changed so much that students that are in high school now were born with a device in their hand, that they don't remember a time before the internet, that they are unaware of how the world worked before Instagram, Facebook, Twitter took over. And as a result, social currency has changed significantly. There's multiple studies done on the impact of Instagram specifically on mental health of teenagers, and they've noticed that it's got a horrific impact as far as valuing themselves, because instead of pictures being something fun that's happening in the background, they're actually the focal point. And that social currency comes in the form of likes and retweets and shares. And that if someone posts a picture that doesn't get the social currency they're looking for, it doesn't get the amount of likes, it doesn't get the amount of reaction that they're hoping, it can be devastating to that individual. Additionally, social media is always on. As a kid, in grade 7 and 8, there was some bullying that I experienced as well. But I was able to go home. And when I got home, my bullies weren't there. The people that I spent my time with after hours outside of school were not the people that were contributing to the bullying. And that I could get a break, that on weekends or during the summertime or even after school on a Tuesday evening, I could go home and know that that wasn't going to be something that was happening to me. Nowadays, in my work, I run across kids all the time who express how overwhelming it is to know that the bullies are always there. That if they turn on Instagram, if they open up their phone and then they go on Facebook, they are opening themselves up to criticism. They are opening themselves up to rejection. Oftentimes adults will give the answer of, well, just turn off your phone. Don't go online. It's not worth it. But to a student who sees that as their social circle, as their connection point to their peers and the people around them, that's much easier said than done. That even if the consequence is massive, they feel as though they need to connect to their peers in this way in order to have any shot of being a socially viable teenager. And that to miss out on a day's worth or even an hour's worth sometime of Instagram or Twitter or Facebook will cause them to be behind their peers. Our students today are better connected to the world around them than ever before in history, but they're also lonelier because social media is a charade. People post and edit their pictures in their happiest moments. There's very little vulnerability, and there's no need for vulnerability if you never have to connect with anybody. Having a real friend is someone who's going to look you in the eye and ask you how you are. And when you say, I'm okay, they're going to push back with, tell me the truth. How are you? On social media, if I post a picture of myself with an inspiring caption and it gets 35 likes, I don't have to ever be honest with anybody because socially I've been validated. And this is causing massive problems in the development, the social development, the belonging in our teenagers. It's leading to a lot higher instances of self-harm. It's leading to a lot higher instances of substance use. And it's leading to a lot higher instances, as you saw in the statistics, of suicide and suicide attempts. We need to be able to engage this. We need to be able to understand this reality, that it's not as easy as just don't go on your phone, that it's not as easy as just not engaging, because things have changed. Social media has a grip on teenagers that I don't know if the world saw coming. In dealing with self-injury and suicide and engaging that big, heavy topic, I think it's important to make a couple distinctions. Self-injury, when we think of it, we typically think of cutting. We think of cutting on the arms, cutting on the wrist. Oftentimes that will be associated with someone who is suicidal, at least socially. That's the perception. Clinically, there's a very significant distinction made between non-suicidal self-injury, which is cutting and hurting yourself in a non-lethal fashion, and a suicide attempt or suicidal ideation, thoughts of dying. Often for students in particular, cutting is a way, self-injury is a way to express an emotional or internal pain on the outside. It makes sense of something that they're feeling in their eyes. It's something that goes, well, my heart is hurting from rejection, of loneliness, maybe trauma or abuse, so I'm going to express it in a way that makes more sense in my own mind. And the cutting becomes a form of coping. The human body is absolutely unbelievable and will release endorphins or adrenaline in response to pain. This is common. It happens with people who exercise vigorously. We've heard of the runner's high. It happens to people who experience real injury, whether it's a broken bone or a burn, that your body floods the brain. The brain floods itself with endorphins and adrenaline, which are can bring feelings of intense, not relief, but it's an intense feeling, and it can be a desirable feeling. Adrenaline is something people get addicted to. And so students who start cutting are always chasing that first feeling of that flood of adrenaline, a flood of endorphins. And that's why the cutting behavior can become so addictive, even if there is shame brought along with the behavior. Sin often brings shame, and destroying our own bodies is devastating to God, that we were made in His image and that we want to treat our bodies as though they were made in God's image. And when someone is hurting to the point of feeling like hurting themselves is the only option, cutting is sometimes a way that students will tell you they're actually trying to stay alive. Because when they cut, they feel. When they cut, there is actual response, and they feel better afterwards for a little while. It's not a forever fix, but for a student that is desperately trying to find an answer to an intense and a deep emotional pain, sometimes it works. And so as youth leaders, when we get the opportunity, when a student trusts us enough to show us the self-injury, to say, I struggle with this. We're going to have all kinds of feelings. We're going to have emotional responses. We're going to react, but we need to hide that. We need to be the rock in that moment. That's not to say we don't respond. It's not to say that we don't take it seriously, but to respond with disgust, to respond with fear or dread, will be something that shuts that student off from actually coming to us again. How we respond in that moment can be a significant indicator to the student as to how we actually feel about them. Though we may love them, regardless, we have to show a level of stability and a level of understanding, even when things are complicated and hard to understand. We are in a unique time globally. While we're recording this, we are in the middle of a global pandemic, which means that we are on orders to stay home, and it means that we are not involved socially like we normally would be. Most students will report being able to fake their way through a day of school. That even if they are hurt, even if they are struggling, even if they are depressed, that they actually will be able to put on the brave face while they're around their friends and their teachers, but that the hardest part of their day is going to be when they're home and isolated. That section of the day has just been expanded in a huge way. That students who may have found their relief in going to school and rubbing shoulders with their peers and sitting in classrooms where there are other well-meaning and safe adults keeping an eye on them, are now in their homes 24/7 and have been for some time. This means that our students have been in a much more significant and vulnerable place for their mental health. That students who have dealt with trauma, that students that have dealt with any sort of abuse are now alone with their thoughts. And for all of us, even for healthy adults, when we're going through a hard time, we know that the hardest parts of our day to deal with are generally the lonely moments, the moments where we're with our thoughts. And they can be very healthy because they can help us process what's going on. But if our thoughts are nothing but pain, nothing but debating with ourselves whether we're valuable, when we're dealing mostly with an existential crisis of who we are and whether we're worth it, this can bring a lot of despair. And that is what's happening currently. Recently, the Children's Help Phone published a statistic that their calls are up almost 300% since the beginning of the pandemic. And that in the United States, certain states are reporting almost a doubling of their suicide attempts. That COVID-19 is bringing with it a second wave of crisis, and it doesn't have to do with the public health crisis that we're being updated on. That as youth leaders, reach out, have the difficult conversations on social media. It's very easy to send a text and go, checking in, how are you? And when the student replies, I'm good, thanks, we can leave it there because it's a lot of work to check in. Make it awkward, be uncomfortable, ask the question, confirm how a student is really doing, and give them permission to reach out. Say things like, I know this is tough, it's hard on everyone, and if you ever just need to chat, I'm here. That'll open up the door potentially to other conversations, and if nothing else, it'll give the student some reassurance that there are people they can talk to in the middle of this pandemic. Hopefully it will give us a better understanding. Hopefully it will give us more compassion and a little bit more grace, a little more flex to students who are struggling when this is over, because they've been spending their time by themselves for 3 months trying to cope and trying to take care of themselves. And sometimes that comes out in profane ways. That sinners tend to respond sinfully to being sinned against, as Paul Tripp would say. And this means that unhealthy coping mechanisms will appear in every teenager and every human, but specifically coming out of this pandemic time, where we want to be looking for unhealthy patterns that have been developed over a period of isolation in an attempt to stay alive. And we want to engage that, and we want to be able to not beat around the bush with our students and be able to communicate clearly with them. Oftentimes we're asked as mental health workers to give practical tips on dealing with depression, on dealing with anxiety, and dealing with some of the top most common struggles that youth have. So here is a list of signs and symptoms and ways to help students who are depressed or struggling with depression. So the signs and symptoms are withdrawn, disinterested, tired, moody, high highs and low lows, lack of hygiene and self-care, self-injury and suicidal ideation. These are commonly seen symptoms. Almost in the majority of cases of depression will have some combination of these. Obviously, near the end, not taking care of their hygiene and self-care, hurting themselves and thinking of suicide are signs of more severe depression. How we're going to help is that we're going to be aware. We want to keep in mind the baseline behavior of our students. What's normal? Is the student a normally hyper student who is now all of a sudden incredibly withdrawn? Or is this a student who's already withdrawn and this is the norm for them? Because that makes a significant difference in how we're going to actually engage them. That we want to be present. Job's friends were unbelievably effective in their first 7 days with him, and then they opened their mouths. Paul says in Romans chapter 12 to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. That we want to be aware of what's going on around them and know the student, but we also want to be present in their suffering and not have them feel as though we're trying to make them something that they're not. That we want to mourn with them when they mourn, just as much as we want to rejoice with them when they rejoice. We want to listen actively. We want to make sure that the students know that they're heard. This involves, really investing in the questions we're asking, really paying attention to when we're listening. It can be very easy to dismiss students at the end of youth group when we're tired and we want to go home. Some of the best pastoral advice I've ever been given is to be with the ones you're with, to be present with the people you're with, and listen actively and really pay attention to what they're saying. And this can have a huge impact on every student, but specifically with a student who's struggling in a crisis. Again, watch for changes in that baseline behavior. Be aware of the baseline and watch for changes to it. A change in a baseline behavior is usually going to be an indicator of some kind of emotional distress. Whether it is an increase in energy level, whether it is an increase in social activity, a kid who normally likes to be by themselves all of a sudden refuses to be alone. Watch for those things. You know your students. I can't be in all the youth groups, just like any of us can't, but that the students we're with are kids that we can learn and know deeply. And when we know a student, when we build that relationship, we're going to be aware of the changes that come. We want to make sure we're building a team around the student, that as youth workers, we're not the be-all and end-all. And that if a student is in crisis, specifically a significant crisis where we're worried about the safety of that student, we want to bring the appropriate people into the conversation. That includes parents, that includes youth workers, that includes medical professionals and counselors. We want to make sure that this student understands they are worth the effort, they are worth the investment, and that we are going to do whatever is possible to build a team around them. And that our role as youth workers is that we're going to communicate truth constantly. One of the things I've found the most valuable in my own work and practice is communicating value. You are worth it. I am glad to spend time with you. You're important, that I'm proud of you. These are words that sometimes we want to imply rather than actually say explicitly. So, I spend time with them, so they should know that I care, that they're worth it. But I think communicating that using very explicit terms, you are not bothering me. I want to hear from you. I'm excited to spend time with you, and I'm grateful that I get a chance because you're worth it. Sounds corny, but I think a lot of our students are starving for that type of affirmation, that they're valuable, and that can be a huge tool that is used by God to get a student out of through a crisis. That we want to communicate to the students that we cannot take this from them, but we can be with them through it, and that is significant. The second slide is on anxiety. The signs and symptoms here are a lack of effort, of more moodiness, avoiding responsibilities, activities, or social situations, feeling of being consistently overwhelmed, and in more extreme cases, panic attacks. Anxiety and depression will often present together, that someone can simultaneously be depressed and exhibit signs of anxiety, and these will both peak in some pretty severe symptoms that we're trying to avoid for all of our students. How to help is exactly the same. That the better you know your students, that the better relationship you have with them, the better communication you're able to have with them, the more help you'll be. We won't help students we don't know very well. We want to be able to be with the ones that are around us and allow them to grow comfortable with us in a way that will hopefully lead us into a relationship where we can be helpful in the middle of crisis. That we want to watch for those changes, we want to listen actively, we want to build a team around the student and communicate truth to them, and in doing so are able to have the crisis be a time of growth for them and a time where they really begin to understand that there are people out here that love them and are willing to invest in them in ways they didn't anticipate, even when they are not themselves, when they're not at their best. I know we flew through some of this material quickly and that we were absolutely not able to touch on everything that is a presenting issue for students today in Canada, in youth groups around the country. But I hope that the material was helpful, and I hope it gave you some practical tips, and I'm hopeful more than anything that it's piqued your interest in learning more about these areas that are so relevant to the youth today in Canada, the youth that we see all the time in our church buildings and in our youth group settings. And I'm hoping that you will consider investing some time in learning how to deal with these, and that you would be better because of it.